So docks are one of those safety things that a lot of people don't think about on their property, but when you have small children and they want to be able to go down near the water and you want people to be safe from snakes, I originally put a dock up because my son wanted to go down near the water. We have the eastern cottonmouth, which is a highly venomous snake, and I wanted to be able to provide an area he could go to and fish and enjoy being down at the pond without being in harm's way. So in this video we're going to be covering the different types of docks that there are and what is the best type of dock to install on a private pond or lake and how we went about building ours. Something many of you don't know about me is that I've built a lot of docks in my life. When I was in high school, I used to go to the Outer Banks for the summertime. I loved windsurfing, so I would teach windsurfing while I was out there, but then on my days off, I would often find odd jobs, like working at Dairy Queen. And one of my odd jobs was actually building docks on the sound side for private homeowners. These docks were stationary docks, and they were normally built above the high water line, and then sometimes they would have floats that would move up and down with the tides. Other times they just had little steps that would go down to the boat. A lot of these had boat lifts because you can't keep your boat in the water tied up to the dock with the tides coming in and out and raising up and down. Those are more complicated docking systems. My job back then was more or less helping to put in the pillars. We had big suction machines that we'd go down and we'd remove all the muck, try and get the supports down as far as we possibly can. As I got a little older in college, I took a job working at some summer camps I frequented as a child. My job at the summer camps was what they called the boat master, which is basically a waterfront director for the camps. And during my first summer as the boat master, my job was to essentially go out and rebuild the entire docking infrastructure for the camp. Now these docks were entirely floating docks, and they were built into the design of T-docks, H-docks. We had a couple docks that just went out straight and narrow, and they had the large black flat floats underneath them. We also had docks that were built so that half of them were floating, the other half went down into the water, and this was so that we could pull our sailboats up onto the docks very easily. It kind of created a ramp, and we had these platforms that kind of went down. They had floats on one side, the other side just kind of sank into the water. We would be able to pull the sailboats up onto those docks and de-rig them or rig them. It was a great learning platform for campers. So we had all sorts of docks at that camp that we had to build or rebuild during the time that I was there. Building these docks was fairly simple, and it's very similar to the way that I'm about to tell you, or how we do it on our ponds, but there are going to be issues with it, and there are issues that weren't a big problem for us up in Maine because we had the manpower to remove the docks at the end of every summer and put them back in at the beginning of each summer. The docks that we built in Maine were anchored by using large stones with chains that went down underneath the water, or we drove in posts alongside the dock to help stabilize the dock as you walked on it. The reason why a lot of floating docks, you don't see too many that just go straight out. They usually go out and they tee off, or they go out into what we call an H-dock. And that is for stability reasons. When you have a floating dock that just goes straight, it will often tip from side to side as you walk on it because it's floating, it's not very stable. So that is something to keep in mind when you're designing a dock for your pond, is that if you're going to build a floating dock, it's going to be very difficult for you to build a floating dock that's going to be stable without putting either a T on it or a large platform at the end to help stabilize the entire system. You can use rods and drive the rods in on either side of the dock, anchor the dock to those rods, and it'll at least kind of help it as it teeter-totters as you walk on it, but it's still not going to be a very stable structure. Moving on to docks for ponds, I think it's important to remember that ponds fluctuate in their water levels, the same as lakes, the same as rivers, the same as it would on the ocean. I've seen a lot of people build permanent structures. It seems to be the most fundamentally easy thing to do because you can just drive a few posts into the ground or the bottom of the pond and then build your structure out on top of those posts. The problem with that is that, number one, you have wood that's going into the water, it's staying in the water, and regardless of whether or not that wood is treated, it will eventually rot or soften, and that'll change the aspect of your entire dock. And if it starts to rock into a certain way, it's going to start loosening up bolts and it's going to start becoming cockeyed. I've also seen these docks built way too low to the water because people want to be able to hang their feet in the water or climb up on it if they were swimming in the pond. But the problem is that as the pond water rises, the docks end up sinking under. And again, the same thing happens. When you leave even treated wood underwater for a long period of time, all the holes where you've screwed in or nailed in your boards they'll start to soften, and all your fasteners will slowly become loose and the whole thing will start to fall apart, not to mention the wood rotting. Building a dock in this fashion makes absolutely no sense. It does create, for the first year, a stable structure, one that doesn't rock at all, but after that point in time, it'll start to fall apart and deteriorate very quickly. So then we go on to floating docks. The problem with building a floating dock for most people is that if you have a floating dock out there the entire winter long and you have ice or your pond freezes over, a lot of times those big square black floats that you have under professionally made floating docks will crack because the ice expands and pushes around that float, and it causes that float to crack and get holes in it. In which case, when you come out the next spring after the ice is melted, your dock has now sunk into the water and you have to replace floats. The only way to prevent that is to take the entire floating dock out of the water, and that's not practical for most people. Up in Maine at the camps, we had the manpower to do that, so it was practical. What's the best way to build a floating dock, especially if you're in an area where your water temperatures do reach a freezing point where they are going to freeze and turn to ice? That's where we get into the barrel docks. The barrels are something that, number one, you can get much cheaper than those big floats that you see underneath a lot of professionally made floating docks. You can usually pick up barrels at a recycling facility and they've been cleaned out and they're basically being resold for a minimal amount of money, sometimes as low as $5 or $10 a piece. Each of these barrels, depending on whether or not you're using a 55-gallon or a 30-gallon barrel, will hold a different amount of weight with their buoyancy. I think a 30-gallon or so barrel is around 250 pounds, and then a 55-gallon barrel is around 450 pounds. If you're going to build an extensive dock structure, I would suggest going with the 55-gallon barrels. The other benefit to using these barrels is that, yes, they float. They're actually more buoyant than the big square floating platforms that you'll see under other floating docks, and they'll keep your entire docking system out of the water, often by as much as 20 inches. Having the wood staying above the water that far will help maintain the wood and keep it from getting wet and rotting out, and your joints and pieces where you've nailed and screwed it together from becoming soft and falling apart. There's a lot of benefits to the barrels. The other benefit to barrels is that as your pond freezes over and the ice pushes in on it, it will actually just lift the dock upward because it's more of a rounded edge, so it's harder for the ice to penetrate the barrels. That and the barrels themselves are a much thicker, hardier plastic than the typical floats that you would find underneath a floating dock. If you're thinking about building a dock and you're trying to figure out what's the best kind of dock, I have built many docks. I have built a lot of docks along the ocean. I've built a lot of docks in ponds. I've even worked on some docks that are in rivers, and I can tell you that if you're building a dock for personal use on personal property in a pond where the water fluctuates, the absolute best decision you can make is to go with a floating barrel dock. So let's check out my design for a barrel floating dock. This is one that I built at my previous home, and we may eventually build one or two out here for one of our ponds when we get that far. Right now we're still working on restoring the ponds. First, you need to build the base of your structure. I put 2x8s around the outside, and then I used 2x4s along the inside. The reason being is that if you look at this photo, I used the 2x4s at about a 12-inch spacing so that when the barrel rested underneath them, it actually lifted up the dock and kept a lot of the dock above the water. And then I put another set of 2x4s going down the center to hold those barrels into place. I started my structure with a design of 6 50-gallon barrels. However, after adding on all the heavy decking and the furniture, I found that I needed a little more buoyancy. So later in the project, I actually added 4 more barrels to the overall structure. These additional barrels were actually added to the front and the back side, going in the opposite direction of the other barrels. This also helped with the buoyancy of the entire dock. I built a ramp that went out into the water to where I had it attached to the dock. This ramp had a float on one end and then was attached to the land by using long metal stakes on the other end. This way, the part out in the water could float and adjust up and down with the level of the water and the dock, while I had something on the land that was secured. Once the dock was in the water and floating, I simply added the decking material. I used your standard decking material that you would have on any other deck. Then I installed railings that went around the entire structure. I did leave an opening at the back, which I put chains across to keep trespassers off of the dock, and I left one opening on the front of the dock, which we used to access our john boat from. I furnished the dock with tiki torches that had citronella oil in it to keep away bugs. I also added some fishing rod holders so that we could go night fishing for catfish. Finally, we added some furniture and a fire pit for our evening enjoyment.